Before the waters covered the face of the earth, before the familiar world we know today took shape, there existed another age. A world so distant in human memory that it now appears only faintly, like a glimpse through a narrow crack in the curtain of time that closed long ago. It was an ancient world, old not only by years, but weighed down by what had unfolded within it. That world carried a breathtaking, overwhelming grandeur. Mountains rose steeply like colossal walls reaching into the sky. Stone was carved into massive structures, dark, cold, and imposing, standing alone against the passage of time. Enormous statues, now reduced to broken torsos, lay scattered like forgotten warnings. Yet this beauty was not gentle. It was violent, unsettling, as though the earth itself bore a fracture that could never be healed. This was not a world that vanished naturally. It did not fade with time, nor did it collapse through the randomness of history. It was buried, erased, placed under a judgment so severe that the memory of it was submerged deeper than the very waters of the Great Flood. What remains are only traces, mountains shaped in strange forms, black stone cities whose names no one remembers, vast ruins lying in silence, as if they dare not speak their own story. Many call it myth. Others claim it is merely a tale invented to explain humanity's fear of natural disasters. But if one listens more carefully, if one sets aside the habit of dismissing what feels unfamiliar, it becomes clear that this world does not stand entirely outside of history. It is mentioned, briefly and cautiously, in the opening chapters of Genesis. It appears more vividly in the Book of Enoch, is echoed in Jubilees, and reverberates in the unspoken fears of ancient civilizations. These texts do not tell their story in the way we might expect. They do not dwell on detail, do not offer thorough explanations, and at times merely hint with a few lines before moving on. Yet it is precisely this silence that provokes questions. Why would an era so significant, one that led to a global cleansing, be referenced so sparingly? Why were things that once existed pushed to the margins of collective memory? Perhaps because that world was too terrifying to remember, not only because of what was destroyed, but because of what once lived within it. There are things which, when faced directly, force humanity to confront its own limits, the fragility of an order long believed to be secure. And sometimes, the easiest way to keep living is to allow time to bury everything. This story is not told to challenge faith, nor to deny what people have long believed. It is opened for a simpler purpose, yet a more difficult one: to unlock a sealed memory, to look directly at a chapter of history that was deliberately erased, and to listen to what it still whispers to later generations. Not in search of sensation, but in pursuit of understanding, even if that truth is uncomfortable and sometimes compels us to reconsider the world we inhabit. Beneath the sky of that ancient world, when humanity was still learning how to name itself, other beings were quietly present. They did not live as humans do, nor did they belong to the earth, yet they were placed very near to humankind. Ancient texts call them the Watchers. Their name reveals their role: to stand between heaven and earth, observing, protecting, and guiding humanity through the earliest steps of history. The Watchers were not gods to be worshipped, nor humans bound by flesh. They were celestial beings, entrusted with authority and responsibility. They understood the order of creation, knew their limits, and for a long time they kept their proper place. They watched humanity grow, learning to cultivate the land, to build, to bear children, and to die. They witnessed joy and sorrow alike, the fragility and longing of creatures made of flesh and bone. But it was there that a dangerous boundary began to form. Observation, when prolonged, easily becomes attention. Attention, when no longer held within discipline, slips into curiosity. And curiosity, if unchecked, leads to desire. The line between seeing and wanting is far thinner than one might imagine, especially for those who have never learned how to refuse. They began to see humanity no longer as a duty, but as something intimate. Earthly women, with a beauty unlike that of heaven, not radiant or majestic, but alive, warm, and finite, left their mark in the gaze of the Watchers. It was the beauty of being born and growing old, of sweat, of sorrow and genuine joy. A beauty imperfect, yet precisely for that reason impossible to turn away from. At first, it was only a vague sensation, difficult to name, a strange stirring in hearts accustomed to order and distance. But emotion, once allowed to exist, seeks to grow. Desire emerged, not loudly, but quietly, like roots creeping into the soil. Curiosity became lust. And with lust came the most dangerous thought of all, that perhaps they had the right to cross that boundary. There was no thunder splitting the sky, no single moment of obvious downfall that could be easily pointed out. The descent was silent. Whispers began to appear, first in thought, then among the watchers themselves. They drifted on the wind, from mountain peaks down to lower lands, like questions not yet spoken aloud, but already powerful enough to sow rebellion. If we only observe, are we missing something? If we were created with the capacity to feel, was it meant only for us to stand apart forever? Each whisper seemed harmless, but when many whispers converged, they formed a collective voice strong enough to blur the memory of original duty. The watchers began to convince themselves that drawing close to humanity was not betrayal, but understanding. That touching the earthly realm was not a fall, but the fulfillment of their mission in another form. At that moment, the fall had already begun, though no one yet called it by that name. Not through action, but through a shift in how they saw themselves. When beings entrusted to observe begin to place themselves at the center of desire, crossing the boundary becomes only a matter of time. And in the heavy atmosphere of the world before the Great Flood, those whispers continued to spread, waiting for a moment powerful enough to turn thought into action. Those whispers did not fade with the wind. They gathered, thickened, until they were no longer the private thoughts of individual watchers, but a shared intent. And then, a place was chosen. Mount Hermon, a high, solitary mountain where the sky seemed to hang lower than usual, and the ground itself felt as though it were listening. There, 200 watchers assembled, not by chance, but by design. Not to observe, but to decide. They knew exactly what they were about to do. None of them could later claim they had stumbled into it by accident. That was why they chose to bind one another with an oath. A collective vow, spoken not in the light of heaven, but between sky and earth, where turning back would no longer be easy. They swore that they would descend together, step down into the human world as one. They swore they would take the daughters of humankind as wives. And more importantly, they swore that no one would turn back, no one would withdraw once the boundary had been crossed. That oath was not merely a commitment. It was a way of steadying themselves. Alone, fear might still have been strong enough to hold them back. But when 200 stood facing the same direction, hesitation became weakness, and silence was seen as betrayal. In that moment, individual responsibility dissolved into collective will. There was no longer an I, only a we. And it was precisely this that turned a wrong choice into a turning point in history. When they descended, the world did not understand what was happening. This was no ordinary arrival. Beings from the heavenly realm carried with them a light that did not belong to the earth. Their radiance flared like fragments of stars fallen from the night sky. Their eyes burned, not with a human gaze, but as though fire itself had learned how to observe. Their voices rang deep and resonant, both commanding and alluring, leaving listeners unable to tell where truth ended and enchantment began. Humanity called them by the only names it knew: gods. Gods who walked upon the earth, not because people wished to betray the sacred, but because they had no other framework with which to understand what stood before them. In a world still young, where the boundary between nature and mystery was not yet clearly drawn, their appearance felt like confirmation that the heavens had bowed down and chosen to remain. But what humanity saw was only the surface. Behind that splendor lay a profound misalignment. When the watchers set foot on the earth not by command, but by their own desire, the order of creation began to bend. What had once been clearly divided between heaven and earth grew indistinct. Roles were reversed, boundaries blurred, and once order no longer stood upright, everything built upon it began to tilt. That descent did not bring blessing, as many had believed. It brought with it a quiet yet deep disturbance, spreading like cracks beneath the foundations of the world. For when those created to observe chose to intervene, and when heavenly power mingled with earthly life, what changed was not merely the fate of a few individuals, but the structure of reality itself. From that moment on, the world before the Great Flood was no longer the world it had been. From that descent, something appeared on the earth that had never existed before. Not at once, not in a blaze of light, but gradually, as the inevitable consequence of a broken order. The Watchers bound their lives to humankind, and from those unions a new race was born. Ancient texts call them the Nephilim, not fully of heaven, nor truly of earth. Hybrids, bearing the mark of both realms, yet never wholly at home in either. From the moment they appeared, the Nephilim were different. Their size surpassed that of ordinary humans, not only tall, but carrying a presence that made others instinctively step back. Each of their steps seemed heavier than the ground itself, each movement suggesting they had not been born to live within the limits the earth imposed. Their strength exceeded anything humanity of that age could imagine. Tasks that required dozens of people working together were, for them, no more than unconscious gestures. Yet what made the Nephilim dangerous was not only their bodies. From the Watchers they inherited a kind of light that was difficult to name, a beauty that was not pure, yet deeply compelling. It was not gentle, but sharp and cold, a blend of authority and arrogance. In their eyes there was always something that seemed to measure and judge, placing themselves above everything around them. And very quickly, they began to believe that this was exactly where they belonged. Humanity's initial response to the Nephilim was not fear, but awe. In a world unaccustomed to absolute superiority, these beings appeared as embodiments of strength and glory. Stories about them were passed from village to village. Their feats were woven into epics. The places they dwelled were elevated into sacred ground. Temples were built, not only to honor them, but to seek protection from those considered greater than humankind. For a brief time, the Nephilim became the center of the world. Their presence offered a false sense of safety, as though standing beneath those immense shadows was enough to drive every danger away. People willingly handed over authority, wealth, even their voices to those who were stronger. And the Nephilim, growing accustomed to such reverence, began to see it as their due. But admiration did not last. When power ceased to be used for protection and instead became a means of asserting dominance, fear began to creep in. The Nephilim did not merely receive tribute, they demanded it. They did not merely exist, they ruled. What had once been given in reverence slowly turned into forced submission. And with that shift, human society changed. No longer a community, but a hierarchy. No longer cooperation, but dependence. Humanity began to live beneath the shadow of the Nephilim. Decisions great and small were no longer made by mortals. Resistance, even when no more than a whisper, could be crushed by violence. Fear became part of everyday life. And when fear lasts long enough, it turns into bondage. No visible chains were needed, only the presence of those who could not be opposed. The true nature of the Nephilim gradually revealed itself in the way they wielded their strength. They were not born to rule with wisdom or responsibility. They lacked the one thing essential to leadership, self-restraint. They did not know how to stop, how to be satisfied, how to yield. Power, to them, was not a tool, but an identity. And when power becomes identity, everything else exists only to be consumed. The Nephilim began to take more than they needed. They ate until the land was stripped bare. They seized until communities fell apart. They used violence not only to suppress, but to gratify themselves. The destruction that followed them was not always loud, but it was constant, like a hunger that could never be filled. And while humanity struggled to adapt in order to survive beneath that domination, the world around them began to show the first signs of a deep and growing imbalance. The dominance of the Nephilim was not built on physical strength alone. If it had been only size and brute force, they could not have suffocated the world so quickly and so deeply. What truly caused that age to slide into corruption was knowledge, something meant to illuminate, yet in the wrong hands, it became darkness. And among the Watchers, one name became more closely bound to that distortion than any other: Azazel. Azazel was not the first to fall, but he was the one who went the farthest. While many of the Watchers still hesitated between their former duty and their newly awakened desires, Azazel chose open defiance against the order of heaven. He did not merely want to live among humanity. He wanted to give them what had never belonged to them. Not gradually, not at the right time, but in a reckless flood, as though to prove that the boundaries of creation could be broken. The knowledge Azazel brought down to the earth was not simple understanding meant to help humanity live better. It consisted of sharp, dangerous secrets, requiring a maturity that humankind at that time did not possess. He taught the forging of metal into weapons, not merely for hunting or defense, but for organized killing. Knives, swords, and spears ceased to be tools of survival and became symbols of power. From that moment on, war was no longer a last resort, but a familiar choice. Alongside weapons came subtler forms of knowledge, harder to see, yet no less destructive. Azazel taught magic, spells, and methods of manipulating emotion and will. Seduction was no longer a natural attraction, but a technique. Words were sharpened to deceive, gazes turned into instruments of control. Humanity began to learn how to dominate one another not through open force, but through invisible threads. Then came astrology. The movements of the heavens, once established as rhythms of time and season, were turned into tools for manipulating fate. People no longer looked to the stars in wonder, but to calculate, predict, and bend the order of nature to their own advantage. When the sky itself was dragged down and used as an instrument, reverence slowly disappeared. Even what had once been meant for healing did not escape corruption. Medicines, herbs, minerals, and precious stones, gifts once believed to come from the earth, were overused and misused. They no longer served life, but became means of extending power, concealing decay, or creating illusions of immortality. Stones once reserved for sacred rites were displayed as ornaments of those who ruled. At first, humanity believed it was progressing. More tools, more knowledge, more ability. But the cost of that knowledge soon became clear. As weapons spread, violence became a common language. As magic and spells grew widespread, trust was replaced by suspicion. As astrology was abused, people ceased to take responsibility for their choices, blaming the stars instead. And as remedies were used to mask decay, illness was no longer healed, only postponed. Knowledge, which should have made humanity freer, became an instrument of oppression. Those who held secrets ruled over those who did not. Society fractured not only by strength, but by information. Those who knew more held power. Those who did not were guided, controlled, and discarded. Humanity was no longer bound by ropes or iron chains, but by knowledge it lacked the capacity to govern. The bitter truth was that most people did not realize they were being bound. They believed they were being empowered, when in reality they were only learning to obey more efficiently. Knowledge, once separated from ethics and restraint, ceased to be light. It became a double-edged blade, and in that age, the blade always pointed downward, cutting deep into the very foundations of humanity, allowing corruption to arise not only from outside, but to grow within the human heart itself. When knowledge was twisted and power left unchecked, the first changes did not appear in palaces or on battlefields, but spread quietly throughout the natural world. Nature, the most faithful mirror of the order of creation, began to show signs of instability, not through sudden catastrophe, but through a slow, lingering decay, like a body carrying a disease it could not yet name. Forests were no longer as green as before. Woodlands, once dense and full of life, gradually became sparse and withered. Trees still stood, but lacked their familiar vitality. Leaves fell more frequently, the soil at their roots cracked, as though the roots could no longer find what they needed in the earth. Relentless exploitation to satisfy the needs of the giants drained resources meant to renew themselves through natural cycles. The forest did not die in a single day, but it was slowly forgetting how to live. Rivers no longer flowed as they once had. Waters changed course inexplicably, drying up in some places, overflowing in others without warning. Communities dependent on water grew uneasy as familiar patterns became unreliable. When order above was disturbed, order below could not remain still. Water, once a symbol of life and balance, now carried a sense of unease, as though it too were searching for an escape from a world no longer fit for it. Animals reacted sooner than humans. Herds migrated out of season, abandoning lands that had once been safe. Birds flew lower, cried more often, then vanished from certain regions altogether. Wild beasts became either unusually aggressive or paralyzingly fearful, behaving against their natural instincts. It was as though an invisible signal was spreading, warning them that this land could no longer be trusted. Even the sky changed. Light grew heavy, and the colors of day and night lost their former clarity. Some mornings began under a dull, muted glow, and some sunsets lingered far longer than they should. Ancient texts describe the sky as though it were bowing low, not to draw closer to humanity, but bearing a quiet shame. Creation itself, forced to witness the distortion of its own design, seemed unwilling to reflect what was unfolding below. But the clearest and most terrifying signs of distortion did not lie in nature alone, but in the creatures that began to appear. Beings the ancient texts called abominations, not horrifying merely because of their form, but because their very existence was a deviation. They were creatures half human, half beast, bearing traits that should never have coexisted within a single body. Their eyes were neither purely instinctual like animals, nor fully conscious like humans, but lost and deranged, as if trapped between two natures that could not be reconciled. They were not the result of natural evolution, but products of experiments that crossed forbidden boundaries. In a frenzy of power and knowledge, some dared to experiment on life itself, treating creation as raw material. The line between creation and destruction was erased. What was born had no place in the established order of the world, and thus its very existence became a fracture. The appearance of these beings deepened the sense that the world was losing its balance. Humanity no longer recognized its surroundings. Familiar paths became dangerous. Places once considered safe were now avoided. Fear no longer came from a single, identifiable enemy, but from reality itself as it slowly grew alien. All of this combined into a shared feeling. The world was resisting, not through a will that could be named, but through the withdrawal of harmony. When order is bent for too long, creation does not need to rage. It only needs to stop functioning as it once did, and that alone is enough for collapse to begin. The delicate balance of the world now swayed violently, standing at the edge of an abyss where only one more small push could send everything into irreversible chaos. Amid a world sliding deeper into disorder, where the footsteps of giants shook the ground and the distortions of creation became terrifyingly familiar, there remained a small group of people quietly existing at the margins of that noisy history. They possessed no great strength, held no forbidden knowledge, and were never celebrated in songs praising power. The texts call them the line of Seth, not because they were numerous or remarkable, but because they represented a different way of living, quiet yet enduring. Their lives were simple to the point of being considered ordinary. They worked with their own hands, tilled the land, tended livestock, and built homes from what was available. While many other communities depended on the strength of the Nephilim or sought refuge under the fallen watchers, this group chose to remain within a slow, familiar rhythm of life. For them, labor was not merely survival, but a way of keeping themselves from being swept into the vortex of a world in distortion. One of the things that set them apart was how they faced death. In an age when life was cheapened and violence had become routine, the line of Seth continued to bury their dead with care. They did not leave bodies to be devoured by beasts or discarded as refuse after war. Burial, carried out in silence and respect, was their way of affirming the value of each human life, no matter how small. It was also a quiet declaration that life held meaning beyond strength or power. They did not build grand temples, nor did they display their faith through elaborate rituals. Instead, they called upon the name of God in silence. Their prayers were not proclaimed in public squares, but whispered by the hearth, in the fields, or in the weary moments at the end of the day. Their faith was not meant to impress or to secure immediate protection, but functioned like a slender thread tying them to the original order of creation, an order that was slowly being forgotten. What stands out most is how they looked at the world around them. While others gazed upon the Nephilim with admiration, fear, or longing for power, the line of Seth chose not to fix their eyes on those towering figures. Not because they were unaware of their existence, but because they refused to define their lives by what was distorted. Instead of looking outward, they looked upward, not to find gods walking on the earth, but to remember that there remained a higher order, one that stood above all displays of temporary power. That choice made them outsiders. In the eyes of many, they were weak, slow, even naive. They did not pursue new forms of knowledge, did not learn the arts of war being taught, did not join the structures of power taking shape around them. Yet that very backwardness allowed them to preserve something the rest of the world was losing: the ability to distinguish between what was permitted and what should never be touched. They understood, without turning it into theory, that some boundaries exist not to be tested, but to protect. In an age when crossing limits was praised as progress, the line of Seth chose to remain on this side of them, even if it meant living quietly and at a disadvantage. The light they carried was not dazzling, did not blind anyone, but endured like a small flame carefully shielded against a violent wind. Their presence did not reverse the course of the world, nor did it stop the decay drawing near. Yet within that darkening picture, they existed as remnants of what had once been right. A reminder that even when the order of creation is severely bent, there are still people who choose to live differently, not by fighting the world with violence, but by refusing to become part of its distortion. Within the quiet yet steady flow of the line of Seth, one man emerged, not because of power or extraordinary knowledge, but because of how he lived in a brutal age. His name was Enoch. While much of humanity had grown accustomed to violence, to the presence of giants, and to distortions becoming the new normal, Enoch chose another path. The texts do not describe him as a warrior or a ruler, but with a simple yet profound phrase: he walked with God. That phrase was not a vague metaphor. For Enoch, it described a concrete way of life, day by day, choice by choice. He did not withdraw from the world, nor did he dissolve into it. While many learned to adapt to the new, violent order, Enoch retained a rare sensitivity to right and wrong. He listened, observed, and refused to let the chaos outside silence the voice within. That quiet faithfulness is what set him apart. According to the ancient writings, Enoch was taken into visions that exceeded human limits. He was shown the heavenly realm not as a comforting dream, but as a reality of fire and severity. The throne of God appeared in blinding light, surrounded by angels who never rested. The atmosphere carried not gentleness, but the heavy weight of order and judgment. In those visions, Enoch understood that the world he lived in was not only morally disordered, but standing before a point of no return. He was shown what was to come, the judgment reserved for the fallen watchers, those who had once been entrusted with guardianship but chose to violate sacred boundaries. Enoch was not called to negotiate or to plead on their behalf, but to declare their guilt plainly. It was not a message easy to speak, nor one easy to hear. He was also charged with announcing the fate of the Nephilim, giants who appeared invincible, yet were in truth living out their final days. When Enoch spoke, human reactions were unsurprising. Some mocked him, dismissing his warnings as the fantasies of a dreamer. Others were afraid, because deep down they sensed that what he said was not entirely unreasonable. There were also those who doubted, unwilling to believe that the order they relied upon could collapse. In a world accustomed to gods walking upon the earth, talk of judgment descending from above sounded both foreign and difficult to accept. What stands out is that Enoch did not attempt to persuade through force or miracles. He spoke, and then continued to live as he always had. There was no sign that he sought approval or tried to shield himself from negative reactions. His mission was not to change the majority, but to bear witness to the truth, even when that truth was unwelcome. And then, Enoch's departure was as unusual as his life. The texts record it briefly, yet with haunting weight. He was taken. There was no death, no grave, no funeral rites. He vanished from the world in a way that defied familiar laws. His absence left behind a strange emptiness, quiet, yet persistent. In the context of a world moving steadily toward judgment, Enoch became a silent but significant marker. His existence was a reminder that even in the darkest age, there are still people who choose to walk a different path, not following the crowd, not bowing to distorted power, but keeping alive a living connection to something higher than the collapsing world around them. After Enoch was taken, the world seemed to fall into an unnatural pause. Not peace, but a tense stillness before the inevitable. Signs that had long been present. Nature's decay, inverted order, violence becoming ordinary, now converged, as if all of creation were holding its breath. Judgment did not arrive in absolute silence, but it began with movement on a higher plane, beyond human reach. The archangels were dispatched, each carrying a distinct role, no overlap, no hesitation. Michael appeared as the embodiment of strategy and authority. He did not act in blind rage, but with the cold precision of order. Every arrangement had its place, and the confrontation with the rebellious powers was not chaotic warfare, but a re-establishment of discipline long twisted out of shape. Raphael bore a different mission, quieter but no less vital. He was tasked with healing the world, not by erasing every wound at once, but by halting the spread of what had made it sick. What could be saved was preserved. What had been rendered too distorted no longer had a place. That healing sometimes took the form of removal, for not everything that exists deserves to continue existing. Gabriel was the trumpet of judgment. When that trumpet sounded, it was more than noise. It was the declaration that the time of tolerance had ended. Those who believed their power was permanent began to face a different truth. There was no longer room for ambiguity, no gray space to evade responsibility. Everything was named for what it truly was. Uriel, keeper of secrets and light, did not stand on the front lines, yet his presence was indispensable. He illuminated what had been hidden, exposing the dark corners even their creators did not wish to face. This light offered no comfort, it brought finality. Once the truth was revealed, there was no place left for excuses. The reaction of the world below was swift and violent. The giants, once symbols of unchallengeable strength, turned on one another. Alliances built on violence and self-interest collapsed in moments. The arrogance that had bound them together became the very cause of their inner destruction. No external army was needed, they weakened themselves. Strongholds, built through human labor and the coercion of the powerful, fell one after another. Stone cracked, walls collapsed, not only from physical force, but because their moral foundations had long since rotted. Blood ran across the land, soaking places once called centers of power. There were no songs of victory, only the chaotic cries of a disintegrating order. For the fallen watchers, judgment came in a form that could not be reversed. They were not destroyed outright, but bound and imprisoned in the dark abyss. This was not merely physical punishment, but a complete severing from the role they once held in the heavenly order. Those who once watched were now enveloped in darkness. Those who once taught were silenced. Their time, at least in terms of authority, had come to an end. When everything settled, the world entered another strange silence. Not the calm of peace, but the emptiness left after a storm has passed. What once dominated sky and land had vanished, leaving voids larger than any former presence. Survivors walked among ruins, unsure whether the worst was over or had only just begun. There were no more trumpets, no blazing appearances of angels, yet the sense of an ultimate reckoning still lingered in the air. The world, though partially cleansed, had not yet been renewed. It stood fragile and exhausted, as if waiting for a deeper, broader judgment, a storm aimed not only at rebels, but at the very foundations of life that had been corrupted at their roots. After the shock of heavenly judgments, when the giants had destroyed one another and the watchers were bound in darkness, the world that remained did not become better. Violence did not disappear, it merely changed its form. Chaos settled on the surface, but within, the human heart had been eroded too deeply. In that landscape, among communities accustomed to deceit and cruelty, there lived one man who chose a different way, quietly, persistently. His name was Noah. Noah was a descendant of the line of Seth, carrying within him a faint yet steadfast memory of a bond that had once existed between humanity and God. He did not stand out in a crowd, did not possess a strength that inspired fear, nor did he hold arcane knowledge with which to manipulate the world. What set him apart lay in how he lived. As violence became the common language, Noah chose righteousness. When deceit was praised as wisdom, he held fast to honesty as something that required no defense. Noah's life was rooted in the land, in daily labor and simple responsibilities. He worked, cared for his family, built altars, and cultivated the habit of listening. In a world made loud by power and ambition, Noah still made room for silence. And it was within that silence that he heard what most of humanity had long forgotten, the call of God. The command came without lengthy explanation. It was simple, yet heavy. Build an ark. Not a small boat, but a massive structure in a land that had never known rain. The ark was not meant for trade, nor for war, nor as a symbol of power. It was a vessel for survival. For Noah, this was not an idea to be debated, but a word to be obeyed. When he began the work, the reaction of others was swift and merciless. They laughed, mocked him, called him mad. An ark rising from dry ground, in an age when humanity believed it had mastered everything, was absurd beyond tolerance. The scorn did not come only from strangers, but from those who had once known him. Noah became a source of amusement, an example others used to reassure themselves of their own cleverness. But Noah did not stop. He continued measuring, sawing wood, sealing it with pitch, day after day. His faith did not reside in grand speeches, but in the steady repetition of action. Each strike of the hammer was not merely the sound of labor, but a quiet testimony that he trusted what he could not yet see. He did not try to persuade the crowd, nor did he attempt to justify his choice. He worked as though obedience itself were enough. As time passed, the ark gradually took shape. At the same time, strange signs began to appear. Animals, once wary of humans, started to draw near, coming in pairs and small groups, as if guided by an instinct deeper than understanding. For Noah, this was not something to boast about, but a confirmation that he was not alone in this obedience. The world around him continued to laugh, to eat and drink, to build and forget. No one thought of consequences, for they had grown accustomed to living in the delay of judgment. Noah was different. He understood that there are moments when God's patience is not a sign of approval, but the final pause before everything changes. And amid the noise of a world about to be swept away, Noah remained, not as a hero, but as an ordinary man who chose to believe and to act. The ark was not merely wood and pitch. It was the image of faith translated into action, in an age when most people had forgotten what obedience meant. When the ark was completed and Noah and his family were inside, the world beyond still did not grasp what was coming. Creation, however, already knew. The first signs did not arrive with thunder or fire from heaven, but with quiet, inexplicable movements. Animals began leaving their familiar shelters, crossing plains and forests, pair by pair, small group by small group, moving toward the ark as if drawn by a memory older than humanity itself. No one summoned them, no one drove them forward, yet they came with a precision that left even Noah only able to watch in silence. Above, the heavens slowly changed. The light grew pale, the sun lost its warmth, and the nights stretched longer than before. The wind shifted unpredictably, carrying with it a heaviness that was hard to name. Those who still mocked Noah began to feel uneasy, but that unease was not enough to make them stop and reflect. They were used to living in a world where every warning could be postponed one more day. Then came the moment no one could undo. When everything that needed to be inside the ark was within, the massive door closed. Not by Noah's hand, nor by any human effort. Scripture is clear. God himself shut the door. That act carried a meaning far deeper than a physical gesture. It marked the final boundary between inside and outside, between preservation and judgment. When the door was sealed, the time of mercy had reached its end. The first drops of rain fell lightly and sparsely, almost gently. Perhaps some still thought Noah had been mistaken, that this was only a rare shower. But the rain did not stop. It grew heavier, denser, as if the sky had opened all its reserves. At the same time, the ground began to tremble. Water did not come only from above, but from below. The deep fountains burst open. Ancient waters surged upward with force, as though the earth itself could no longer endure the corruption of the old world. Cities began to disappear. Structures once believed unassailable, stone temples, massive walls, towering monuments raised in pride, collapsed one after another. The waters made no distinction between rich and poor, powerful or weak. They swept everything away. The giants, who had once made humanity tremble, were now helpless before a power that did not come from muscle or weapons. Their arrogance could not hold them upright when the very foundations of the world were submerged. Cries echoed through wind and rain, then gradually faded. Hands that once held power now clutched at anything that floated, but nothing was strong enough to save them. There was no higher ground left to flee to. The waters continued to rise, covering everything that had once been familiar. The old world, with all its violence, distortion, and rebellion, was buried beneath a thick, merciless shroud of water. Amid that destruction, the Ark rose. It did not escape impact, nor did it drift calmly as in painted scenes. It shook and groaned under the force of waves and wind. Yet it did not break, not because of superior craftsmanship, but because it was preserved for a different purpose. Inside, life was kept safe. Humans and animals, breath and heartbeat, all huddled together in a confined space, separated from the world that was dying outside. Day followed day as the waters continued to rise. The last mountaintops vanished beneath the surface. There was no longer a boundary between land and sky, only a vast, silent ocean. The world that had existed before, with its history, its powers, and its sins, now left no trace behind. It was not forgotten by accident, but deliberately erased, like a page that has been fully read and then closed. The Ark drifted through that stillness, carrying within it the seed of something that had not yet begun. The old world was completely dead, and within the silence that blanketed the waters, a new chapter waited for its moment to be opened. After a long period of drifting across the vast ocean, when water still covered everything and no sign of the former world remained, the Ark finally struck something solid. It did not arrive amid cheers, nor did it come to rest gently. It lurched, tilted, and then stood still on the slopes of Mount Ararat, as though the land itself had reached out to receive it. After so many days knowing only water and a gray sky, the silence now carried a different meaning. It was no longer a threat, but a cautious pause. Noah did not rush to step outside. He understood that the retreat of the waters did not mean everything was ready. The world had just undergone too great a cleansing to return immediately to life as before. He waited, watched, listened. Then he released a raven from the Ark. It flew off, circling above the still boundless waters, finding no place to rest, and eventually vanished into the empty expanse. Noah understood that the land was not yet ready to receive life again. Sometime later, he released a dove. It flew out and returned, weary, carrying nothing. The second time, the dove came back with a small olive branch in its beak. Just a fragile sprig, yet it carried a meaning greater than any spoken word. The land had begun to recover. Life, though weak, had found its first foothold after judgment. In that moment, hope did not arrive as a triumphant cry, but as a whisper, quiet, yet sufficient for those willing to listen. When the waters had fully receded and the command to leave the Ark was given, Noah stepped onto the renewed earth with deep caution. He did not run. He did not shout for joy. His feet touched dry ground as one might touch something sacred that had just been returned. The world before him was utterly unlike the world he had known. There were no cities, no temples, no traces of those who had ruled by violence. There was only earth, sky, wind, and a stillness both unfamiliar and profound. The first thing Noah did was not to build a home or divide the land. He built an altar. It was the first altar of the new humanity, raised not for display, but for remembrance. A remembrance that survival did not come from human strength or cleverness, but from grace. In the thin smoke rising upward lingered both the grief of what had been lost and the gratitude for what had been preserved. Then a covenant was established, not through written documents or elaborate rituals, but through a sign visible to all. When the rain had ceased and light pierced the remaining clouds, a rainbow appeared in the sky. It was not a weapon, nor a threat. It was a promise that there would never again be a destruction of the whole world by water. That judgment, though real and severe, was not the final word. The rainbow stood there, bridging heaven and earth, reminding all that judgment and mercy walked together. The new world was entrusted to humanity not so that the past would be forgotten, but so that life might be lived differently in light of its lessons. In air still heavy with the scent of water and fresh soil, a fragile beginning was set down, not loud, not perfect, but sufficient for life to continue forward. When everything had settled, when the waters had withdrawn and the sky no longer bore the heavy gray of judgment, what remained was not merely a new world, but the memory of a world that had been lost. The Great Flood was not simply a natural disaster or a distant historical event. It was a clear boundary between what had once existed and what was forced to begin again, a decisive ending, and at the same time, an unavoidable beginning. The world before the flood was wiped from the earth, but it did not disappear completely. Its echoes remain in ancient stories, in humanity's collective memory, in the lingering fear of civilizations that collapse under the weight of their own arrogance and corruption. Though the forms may change, the essence of the story repeats itself. When humanity believes it can determine good and evil for itself, bend order to serve desire, collapse becomes only a matter of time. The Great Flood reminds us that there are limits not meant to be tested, but to be honored. It did not come in a moment of impulsive rage, but after a long season of patience. Before the waters rose, there were warnings. Before the door was shut, there were opportunities to turn back. Yet humanity, accustomed to living in the delay of consequences, often mistakes patience for permission. What is most striking is that while the world was destroyed because of corruption, life itself was not erased entirely. Amid severe judgment, there was still an ark. Amid chaos and ending, there was still a family preserved. This shows that God does not destroy out of hatred for his creation, but because decay had spread beyond what gentler means could heal. Destruction, in this context, was not the ultimate goal, but a necessary step toward renewal. This story, therefore, speaks not only of the death of a world, but of how a new world was given a chance. A world imperfect, still fragile, still capable of repeating old mistakes, yet founded upon memory and covenant. The rainbow in the sky does not erase the memory of the flood. It keeps that memory alive as a constant reminder. The echo of the lost world is heard whenever humanity places power above responsibility, knowledge above morality, and self above the one who gave life. It resounds in ages when violence is justified, when the distortion of truth is called progress, and when conscience is silenced for immediate gain. This ancient story, therefore, does not belong to the past alone. It continually seeks dialogue with the present. The core message does not rest in fear, but in wakefulness. God destroys corruption when it crosses every boundary, yet he always preserves a seed of life to begin again. Judgment is not the final word, but the stern voice that speaks when every softer whisper has been ignored. And mercy is not indulgence. It is an opportunity offered to those willing to listen and change. The story closes not with the sound of water, but with a quiet question addressed to every generation. When the signs appear, when conscience speaks, will humanity continue to mock as it did before the flood, or will it stop and listen? For before the waters rise, there is always a call, and not everyone chooses to hear it. But the door has never closed without warning.